Psalm 22 shows us even when we feel like God has forsaken us, it doesn't mean he actually has. And in those times when we feel forsaken, we have to cling to God by faith, confident that if we refuse to let go of him, we know he'll never let go of or forsake us. And really, Psalm 22 can be sandwiched in between Psalm 20 and Psalm 21. Because in Psalm 20, remember, the king is getting ready to go to battle, and the people pray to God on the king's behalf, that God will grant their king victory. And the king actually speaks in Psalm 20 and verse 6 and says, "Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand." And so the king is confident before entering the battle that God is going to answer him and to give him deliverance. And in Psalm 21, we see God actually did answer him. God actually did deliver him and give him victory in battle. But now in Psalm 22, it's like it gives us a behind the scenes glimpse of what was going on for the king while he was actually in that battle. And the battle became so difficult and treacherous for this king that at one point he felt abandoned by God. And he says in Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer. And by night, but I have no rest. So in Psalm 20 and verse 6, he was confident, I know God will answer me. But in the middle of the battle, the king is saying, God, you're not answering. Where are you? Have you just abandoned me to die out here? And he describes in excruciating detail the horrible trials that he's facing. He's a worm in verse 6. His enemies are dehumanizing him. His enemies are mocking him and saying, God's not going to deliver you. He describes his enemies as various packs of animals like bulls and dogs and lions who are out to just rip him apart and destroy his life. Really, he's describing an execution here in this psalm, which is a little surprising because you don't really find anything in David's life that seems to support the extreme language that he's using here. But let's be honest, sometimes when we're in the middle of a horrendous trial, we can use exaggerated language because it feels exaggerated. It feels so extreme in the heat of the moment that it feels like we're dying. And he says they divide my garments among them because basically dead people don't need clothing. And so they're saying, hey, let's take David's clothes because he's as good as dead. And yet there's a turning point in this psalm in verse 21, in the second part of verse 21, where he says, from the horns of the wild oxen, you answer me. There's that word answer. God answers him, and now this psalm takes a turn from misery into joy. And now that the king is delivered, the king is evangelistically wanting to tell all of his brethren about the greatness of God who delivered him, because God did not despise the afflicted one, verse 24, nor has he hidden his face from him, but when he cried to him for help, he heard. And as a result, the king gathers all of his people, not just his people, but even foreigners from other nations to come and worship God together and eat a meal of celebration together, and to make it their goal to tell the coming generations about the greatness of God who came through for his king and rescued him even from death. And so our practice is when we're feeling forsaken by God, don't ever forsake him. Continue to cling to him in faith. One writer said, this is a cry of utter distress, but not distrust. Because even in verses 3-5, after saying, God, I'm crying, but you're not answering me. It seems like you've abandoned me. He says, but I know that you're holy and I know that you're faithful because you've delivered my ancestors from all of their troubles. And I've been serving you since before I was born, even in the womb. You were my God. And so he's wrestling with the idea that he feels forsaken, but he knows that he's not, because he knows that God is faithful and that he's been serving him his whole life, and he refuses to stop serving him now, despite his feelings. And of course, there's prophecy all over this psalm. This psalm is quoted more than any other psalm in the New Testament, and ultimately applied to Jesus and his crucifixion. From the cross, Jesus cries out, Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me? In verse 8, when the enemies are mocking him and saying, commit yourself to the Lord, let him deliver him. That sounds just like Matthew 27, where Jesus' enemies were mocking him and saying the same thing. If you're really God's son, trust in God and God will deliver you. And they divided Jesus's garments on the cross. On the cross, Jesus's tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth. It was cleaving to his jaws, like it says in verse 15, because he was so dehydrated and parched. And in John 19, Jesus says, I thirst. And of course, Jesus's hands and feet were pierced in a literal sense, and he was emaciated, and you could see his bones because they had ripped the flesh off of his bones through scourging. And it makes perfect sense that someone under those circumstances would feel abandoned by God, especially because he actually died on the cross and then was put in the grave. Talk about feeling abandoned. You're in the grave. You have died. Where is God? And yet 3 days later, God answered Jesus and he helped his afflicted one. And now because of it, Jesus proclaims God's name in the assembly of his brethren. That's quoted in Hebrews 2 and verse 12. And now we worship with Jesus every week in a weekly meal, honoring God and remembering God from generation to generation because of the way that he rescued our King. And we praise God in knowing even when we feel abandoned, he's still there because he does not abandon his people. He is always faithful to his covenant. And so our prayer today is, Father, I know because of my sins, I deserve to be forsaken by you. And yet thank you so much for sending Jesus to take on the position of feeling forsaken on the cross in my stead so that I can know, despite what I deserve or despite what I feel in the moment, I know you will never leave me, just like you never left David or your son.